Welcome to another episode of The Artsy Raven, a show about writing and publishing with your host, J.F. Garrard.
Hello, welcome to the Artsy Raven. I'm your host, J.F. Garrard, and today we have a special guest, Professor Joseph Sassoon. Joseph is a professor of history and political economy at Georgetown Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and holds an al-Sabah chair in politics and political economy of the Arab world. He is also a senior associate member of St. Antony's College in Oxford. His research interests includes political economy, economic history, Iraq, Iraqi refugees, and authoritarianism. Today we're here to discuss his latest book, The Sassoons, The Great Global Merchants and the Making of an Empire. The book is a generational saga of the making and undoing of the family dynasty, the riveting untold story of the gilded Jewish Baghdadi Sassoons who built a vast empire through global finance and trade, cotton, opium, shipping, banking that reached across 3 continents and ultimately changed the destinies of nations. And they were one of the richest families in the world for 200 years, from the 19th century to 20th, and were known as the Rothschilds of the East. So welcome to the Artsy Raven, Joseph.
Hi,
Can
how are you?
can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started on this journey of researching and writing a book about your family?
Sure. I was going to actually later on read a little bit about it, which got into that question. I actually was not interested in writing the history of the Sassoons. I am an expert on the Middle East. I work on authoritarianism, political economy. But a chance that I detail in the preface that I thought the listeners and viewers might enjoy hearing about it when you tell me to read.
Okay. Um, so while growing up, did you know that your family was very famous?
I knew that the family was very famous, but I was never really interested in it at all. And again, I tell that when my father wanted to tell me about it, I was never really interested in, which is typical of teenagers. I
Okay.
actually later on obviously regretted that quite a lot. Because when I was writing it, sometimes I would think, oh my gosh, if only I could ask him that
Mhm.
simple question about A or B, that would save me so much time and effort.
Well, definitely. People are like books. Like my parents, both of them already passed. And sometimes I want to ask them about something, but they're not around anymore. So you
Right.
just don't know, right?
Yes.
Um, can you describe a bit about the contributions of the Sassoons to Western globalization? Because the Sassoons sort of they did a lot. They started off in one place,
Yeah,
but they
I mean,
spread it.
I think that one of the important things really of the story is the role that global merchants like the Sassoon played in the globalization we understand today. We always think of that we are the generation of technology, we are the generation of globalization. But actually, when you think about it, these people adopted technology, for example, telegraph, for example, building a new shipping that sailed much faster and safer in the oceans across the world, like the Indian Oceans. I mean, people tend to forget that at the time, um, these boats encountered so many hazardous journeys. I read once that something like 10-12% of all these boats were wrecked either because of monsoon, piracy, diseases, on and on. So every day you save, it really becomes important. But also they were really pioneers in figuring out how to build a network and how to use information. Two things which are really relevant to any business today. You need networks and you need information, reliable information. Maybe today we have too much information, but which one is reliable and which one is not? And that really did not change from that time. We're 150 years ago. You still needed both And I think they were among the people who really showed how to establish a global network all around Asia, all around the different parts of the world, the Ottoman Empire, the Gulf, and then Britain, in order to solidify this network and flow of information.
So how did you do some of your research? I mean, I know your family might have some archives, but were there transcripts of the communication going on in libraries and such?
Well, yeah, I going to read about it. I mean, there is I discovered in the National Library in Jerusalem thousands and thousands of their correspondence, including their trading ledgers. And as a result, I realized there is really an incredible story that hasn't been written. And the reason it hasn't been written, that the vast majority of those documents are in what we call Baghdadi Jewish dialect. What does that mean? It means you need to know the Baghdadi Jewish dialect, you need to know Arabic, and all the letters are in Hebrew, but only Hebrew letters, yet you need to know the language. So you need really all the three components, in addition to deciphering the very difficult handwriting.
Oh, so do you know these three languages or did
I
you
do,
hire? Okay.
I
It
am
just
fortunate.
happens. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. So the Rothschild family is another wealthy Jewish family, and they were famous for being an international banking family. And I was surprised to read they actually influenced some outcomes of wars and the future of countries. And does the Sassoon family do something similar to this family?
No, not at all. The Sassoons were never in the banking world or in the money lending business, and they really avoided it at all costs because the founder, David Sassoon, did not believe that money lending and being a merchant are coexistent, and felt that once you start lending money to agents or representatives, it's going to end up badly because relationship will deteriorate, people will not pay you, then you have to waste time chasing money, and you do not have the system because you're not a bank. There was actually I'm not sure really whether they influenced war, the Rothschild, but they raised money to finance war at the request of governments. The Rothschilds and the Sassoon intermarried in the 1870s, when the grandson of the founder, who moved to London and grew up in London by then, married one of the daughters of the Rothschild. And that was an important thing because it really opened doors for the Sassoons with the European aristocracy, and actually also benefited from it politically, because later on the same grandson became a member of parliament, of the British Parliament, inheriting not really directly, but benefiting from the father-in-law, who was also a member of parliament for the same area and had all the contacts.
Oh, wow, that's like a merger of a mega family.
Exactly. And there were many of those European mergers that took place. There was a Russian family from St. Petersburg. There was an Italian family. There was a French family. I think it's these marriages and alliances are standard among those dynasties.
So in the book, there's also a discussion about the downfall of the family. Um, why do you think this happened? I mean, this is a very influential family, but I mean, and also, I guess, very large, right? And they're marrying into other families.
Yeah, I mean, this is really why this story is fascinating, because we tend to read about dynasty and how great they are, but it is really like a graph like that. It's not a collapse. There wasn't a major loss. There wasn't a bankruptcy. is just a huge amount of money that was accumulated over the first 5-6 decades began to be wasted. Why? A number of reasons. One, I think in the rise stages, they really understood very well the role of politics, economics, international news, for example, the role of the British Empire. After World War I think they misunderstood the rise of nationalism, for example, in India, the changes that were sweeping the world. That is an important point. A second point is they really misread the environment at the end of the 19th century and did not understand that many of those commodities, such as cotton, opium, textile, others, are going to be difficult to compete with the entrance of countries like Japan and China into, for example, the textile world. And the opium kind came to a final ending by World War I. Some other families diversified into heavy industries. They diversified into textile manufacturing, but not really heavy industries. And the third and most important reason, at least to me, is the loss of hunger, the loss of willingness to work hard, the loss of identity, their move to Britain and wanting to be desperately accepted by the British aristocracy. They got that, but the price they paid was very heavy because they start spending incredible amounts of money to buy houses and estates and engage in hobbies of the aristocracy, such as hunting and shooting and horse riding, which are all very expensive. And yet you're not bringing in enough money. And I tell my students that, it's hard to make money, but it's much harder to keep it. And frankly, mathematically, when you think about it, when someone dies and has 6 children, the British tax was taking 40 to 50% inheritance tax, estate tax. The other 50% was divided among 5, and they are not working, so they had to sell the parents' home in order to divide it. Then each of them, say, have 3 children, and again, the tax person is taking 50%, and the other is divided by 3. You really could see mathematically how, $1 billion gets to very small amount within 3 generations if you're not earning a lot of money.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that argument before. I was reading how immigrants, I'm in Canada, so my family immigrated from Hong Kong. So they'll work very hard, build up their wealth. And I'm first generation, so I will work very hard. The next generation is gonna squander everything. So that is my expectation.
And it is an issue. I mean, this issue of intergenerational wealth, the succession are all really fundamental issues and problems facing any family business and any dynasty. But even a small family business is really important.
So have any of your relatives read this book? Have they showed any interest?
Yeah, they have. I mean, one of the great things of giving so many talks and virtual talks and interviews and podcasts that some Sassoons are popping up everywhere. I was in Britain, few Sassoons came to presentations in New York, LA, Miami, people email. Yeah, I mean, some of them are delighted about someone writing a book of the history. I think one of the things that I discovered from talking to these people, how much misconception we have about our families, because what happens is there isn't anything written. So you heard from your aunt, who heard from her grandmother, and by the time it gets to, to writing it, my guess is 2/3 of it is really incorrect historical data. This one, for the first time, they are seeing it's not based on interviews and stories, but really archival work of the family, but archives in India, archives in China, archives in Britain, and also a huge survey of the newspapers that were published at the time.
Yeah, you put a lot of work into it. I'm sure they're glad someone did it for them, right? Hi. So what is your next book? Like you've written about your family now. In the past, you've written about Iraq. So do you have something else in the works, or are you taking a break for now?
I have been doing so many talks and traveling so much, really, that I'm trying to enjoy it and cherish the moment, and rather than just, I have a few ideas, but they haven't really developed.
Okay, very nice. Okay, so now you're going to read a bit from the book. So can you tell us a little bit about what you're reading before you
Sure.
start?
So this is really one or two things that you touched on is the answer is here. It's the preface of the book. It tells the reader why I began this book, how I went about it, what impacted me during the writing, from a historical research point of view. It all began with a letter. Returning to my office from lunch one day during a fellowship at Oxford University in early 2012, I was greeted by a handwritten letter addressed to me on my desk, where it had been deposited by the college porter. The return address on the back of the envelope identified the sender as one Joseph Sassoon of Kirkcudbright, Scotland. I have never heard of this town and assumed it was a joke or a mistake of some kind. When I finally opened the letter, however, I found that its author was described. My namesake had read an article of mine about authoritarian regimes, and he thought it interesting enough, but what prompted him to write was our shared surname. He declared himself a descendant of the Sassoons and believed I might be also, and therefore hoped to hear from me. I had never been much interested in the history of the Sassoon family. As a child in Baghdad, I had ignored my father whenever he attempted to educate me about my illustrious forebears, going so far as to literally close my ears to annoy him. Later, when I had embarked on this project, there were many occasions when I wanted nothing more than to hear his tales and ask him a few questions for just a few minutes, but sadly, the wish came 2 decades too late. All this is to say that the letter remained unanswered, and until my partner heard about it, chastised me for my rudeness, and she told me to write back. I did, and suggested to this other Joseph Sassoon that we talk on the telephone, only to be mortified 2 days later when the porter proudly informed me that he had blocked what he thought was a prank phone call from a Joseph Sassoon. When I at last managed to speak to Joseph in Scotland, he told me about his father, the first cousin of the famous poet Siegfried Sassoon, and his grandfather, the husbands of a prominent Günzburg from Russia. Without his encouragement, I doubt this project would have taken off. It was a subject with no relation to the book I had just finished about the archives of Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party, or the one that had brought me to Oxford, which was a comparative study of authoritarianism in the Arab world. But my appetite was whetted. I visited the National Archives at Kew and the British Library in London to read about the family, and traveled to Scotland to meet Joseph, known as Joey. He shared with me what he knew and the trove of pictures that had been passed down to him. I had no idea where the initial excursions would lead. I was born too late to know any of the cast of this book, even the protagonist of the mid-20th century. And although I am descendant from the Sassoons, as Joseph hoped, he was the last ancestor we shared, Sheikh Sassoon. When he fled Baghdad in 1830, fearing the wrath of the authorities to join his eldest son, his other children remained in Baghdad. I am the descendant of one of the siblings of the founder. After the Six-Day War in June 1967, life for the country's Jews in Iraq became increasingly untenable. The rise of the Ba'ath Party a year later exacerbated the situation, and public hangings of Jews followed in 1969. When we finally managed to escape a couple of years later, we left with nothing except for a small bag, closing the door not only on our property, but on a land where my family had lived for centuries. This book is thus intended to be not a family history, but the history of a family, specifically a branch with which I can claim a connection, but of which I am not, in the end, a member. For me, as a historian, what really tipped the balance was the discovery of a trove of untapped archival material. Sometime after reading slipped imperceptibly into research, I went into the National Library in Jerusalem, where most of the family's archives are held. They contain thousands of documents dating from 1855 to 1949. Everything from personal letters to account books, menus for dinner parties, seemingly every scrap of paper kept. The letters between family members tended to follow a similar structure, formal at the beginning and end of the letters, in the middle jumping from one subject to another, and often containing stinging criticism if trade had not been profitable or if one member of the family purchased a commodity at a price that another member considered too high. Most of this business correspondence was written in Baghdadi Jewish dialect, which was their language, and I explained about the different languages that you need to know. Writing this book, I felt sometimes as if the historian in me, the migrant, the Baghdadi Jewish were all jockeying for position. My hope is at the end they coalesced and did not hinder me from investigating the history in an objective and unemotional manner. Research in other archives in London, Delhi, Dallas, Shanghai, Istanbul followed, and with the assistance of some wonderful archivists and researchers, I found much fascinating material produced by and about the family. Some years fell between archives, and for those I relied upon newspapers from China, India, England, the US, and the Bahamas, and official documents of the relevant councils and chambers of the commerce to fill in the gaps. The material grew vast appropriately, given that the Sassoons straddled three empires, that of their adoptive home, Britain, and those of the two commodities whose trade they came to dominate, cotton and opium. Their legacy lay not only in dusty boxes in darkened storage rooms, however. Following the advice of Robert Caro, the great biographer of Lyndon Johnson for historians, to obtain a sense of place, I traveled to the Sassoons' former residence in Mumbai, Pune, the hill station of Mahal Bashwar, the synagogues they built in India and China, their headquarters in Shanghai, their estates in England, and even their graves. The geographic spread is telling. The Sassoons traded with members of seemingly every religion and sect around the globe, traveling extensively not only for business, but to explore new horizons, and they felt at home wherever they settled, despite being a tiny minority in terms of both their religion and their migrant status. They were not unique in their time in amassing several fortunes and rising to the upper echelons of society. But unlike their more famous contemporaries, such as the Rothschilds and the Vanderbilts, they bridged East and West. Their story is accordingly not just that of an Arab Jewish family who settled in India, traded in China, and aspired to be British, but also a vista into the world in which they lived and prospered, as well as its major developments, from the American Civil War to the Opium Wars to the opening of Suez Canal, the introduction of telegraph, as well as the mechanization of textile production. The era they inhabited was driven above all by an encompassing globalization, which they and other merchant families benefited from and influenced, and which shaped our current lives. This book traces not only the rise of the Sassoon, but also their decline, why it happened, how the economic and political world order that had fostered their ascent began to change after the First World War, and how the realization of their aspiration to join the ranks of the British aristocracy drew their attention away from their business and prevented them from adapting to these new circumstances, leading to the winding up of their companies after the Second World War. I'm going to stop here. Do I have more time, or?
You can continue if you want. I can edit this part out.
Okay. This is from the end of the book in afterword. The arc from unassuming beginnings to spectacular success and ignoble end took the two Sassoon companies less than a century and a half to traverse. The sheer rapidity of the opening and closing acts draws the obvious question: why? Why did they thrive where so many other trading families merely subsided or even failed? And having reached the heights that they did, what went wrong? Well, I guess our listeners have to read the book to get all the answers.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to meet me and our listeners. And I wish you best of luck on your next plan.
Thank you
Next
very
book.
much.
For more upcoming episodes of the Artsy Raven about writing and publishing, visit us at jfgarrard.com/arpodcast. A reminder to Patreon subscribers that there's bonus content available for every episode on the Patreon website. If you enjoyed the show, you can show your appreciation by buying us some digital coffee. The Artsy Raven is produced by J.F. Garrard. The voice in the show's introduction is Chris Gorman, and music is by Tim Moore. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe.